This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code Spotify.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming back a returning guest, and that is Lindsay Nelson. Lindsay, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, other than the heat. I'm not sure if it's as bad in Tokyo as it is here in
It's
Kagoshima.
terrible. Absolutely terrible. Yeah.
Yeah. So for listeners, you're going to be hearing this in the future, but we are recording this right at the beginning of August, and it is brutal. I've actually had to move my office into my bedroom because it's just too hot in my office area, and there's no air conditioning in there.
Yep.
But anyway, before we get started with today's pick, why don't you remind people about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. My name is Lindsay Nelson. I am a professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at Meiji University, and my research focuses on Japanese horror films and more generally contemporary Japanese cinema and Japanese popular culture. And I've published mostly about Japanese horror films, and I have a book about Japanese horror films and their relationship to the internet and other kinds of media technology.
Great, awesome. And we had you on last season to talk about a Japanese horror movie, talking about Pulse, the beginning of last season, which the episode just came out at the time we're recording this fairly recently, and I've been getting some good feedback on it. People really enjoyed that discussion we had, so I was very happy with the way it came out as well.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So are there any before we get started with today's movie, is there anything that's happening in your classes? Any interesting horror movies you're looking at these days?
Let me think. So this past semester I taught a class that I've taught before, which is called Haunted Japan, where we kind of do a mix of watching scary movies, but also reading some stuff about folklore and ghost stories and things like that. And this semester was particularly interesting because it was the first time that I actually had a mix of foreign exchange students and Japanese students, and so their reactions to the movies and the stories were quite different at times. I think my favorite was we looked at the Kiyoshi Kurosawa film Creepy, which is this kind of spooky movie about a suburban couple and how they discover that their neighbor is basically a serial killer. But I noticed that immediately one of the foreign students very quickly said, I didn't like this movie. I felt that the married couple didn't seem married at all. They were just very stilted. And then immediately, I was happy to see that one of the Japanese students raised his hand and said, "I completely disagree. They sounded just like my mother and father." um, so that's the kind of exchange I think that you hope for in that sort of class, where you just, the students can learn in real time about the very different perspectives that people have on, all things Japan.
That is very cool, and I've been here so long that kind of complaint from someone from a foreign background, uh, it's something I did not think about at all because we watched Creepy a few years ago. But when you say that, now I'm thinking about, oh wait, if I did see that when I was in America, maybe I probably would have had the same reaction to that.
Yeah, and it kind of thinking about today's film, it also made me realize that I'm sure that there are a lot of reactions to Nobody Knows that would be quite different for someone who's never really spent any time in Japan versus someone who has. In particular, the sort of affect of the mother character. I can, as someone who's lived in Japan for a very long time, to me, she's just very average, and that's a style of speaking and behaving that is not strange. But I can see how someone who hasn't spent much time in Japan would be like, "Ugh, that's creepy. Why is she trying to sound like a baby or something?" So yeah, your experiences definitely color your perceptions there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point about that. I hadn't thought about that too. Like her way of speaking, it did stand out to me, but it didn't stand out in a way that was surprising. Um,
Yeah.
and so in your class up until now, has it been mostly foreign students or mostly Japanese students?
Yeah, so it's an interesting situation. Basically, this class that I'm teaching, Haunted Japan, was originally created primarily for exchange students, but it was created in 2019, and then 2020 came, and there were no exchange students for several years. And so in 2020, 2021, and 2022, I taught the class, and I only had like 4 or 5 students, and they were all Japanese because we essentially didn't have any foreign exchange students for a very long time. And then in 2023, I was on sabbatical. And so this was the first year that I really was able to teach the class in the way it was intended to be taught, which is, a class for exchange students that Japanese students can also participate in. And so I was really happy because I felt like it panned out the way that I wanted it to pan out, which is that the students really got a chance to interact with each other a lot, and to share their very often very different perspectives on the stuff we were reading and the stuff we were watching.
That's very cool. And I can't remember if we talked about this last time. So if we did, and I'm treading over ground, please excuse me. But do you teach the class in English or in Japanese?
Yes, that class I teach in English. I would say that I teach the majority of my classes in English, and every now and then, when there's some kind of difficult concept to talk about, I will sometimes break into Japanese for that. And I teach a seminar that I teach like 80% in English and a little bit in Japanese, but I don't teach any classes 100% in Japanese. And that class in particular is definitely designed, like it's labeled as a class that's in English, and is targeting exchange students.
Okay, very cool. And like we said, we danced around it, didn't give the title, but we are talking today about Nobody Knows, which is not necessarily a horror film, but I mean it's a horrifying situation.
Sure.
Daremo Shiranai in Japanese, and directed by Hirokazu Kore-eda. And this is a movie I have heard about a lot. I'm a little bit more familiar with. I was more interested in it too because Yuya Yagira plays the main character in this Akira, and he was a boy when he filmed this, and I know him now from the TV show Ganaball, which I loved him in that. So I was really keen to see this, and I'd heard about this case. It's based on the 1988 Sugamo child abandonment case, and my wife had seen this movie before, and she had been talking about it too to me, and so I was very interested to check it out, and finally saw it last night. But before we jump too much into my thoughts on it, what's your history with this movie?
So I saw this movie for the first time, I think right around the time it came out, in 2005. And I remember I think I saw it like in Japan. I was able to watch it with English subtitles. Um, and it was, if I remember correctly, I think it was the first Koreda film I had ever seen. And I was just blown away by it. I remember at the time just being really, moved and horrified, and also just incredibly impressed with Koreda as a director. I think it was honestly some of my early exposure to live action Japanese cinema. I had seen plenty of anime before then, but I hadn't seen a lot of live action Japanese films. And so that was, it was a good gateway. And it spoiled me in a sense because I do think, Koreeda is an outstanding director. And so, yeah, so it definitely had an impact on me. And watching it again just the other day, because I think I hadn't rewatched it in almost 20 years. It struck me how much it had stayed with me. Like there were so many very specific shots and moments and lines that I remembered word for word and beat for beat. So yeah, it really had an impact when I saw it.
Yeah, it had an impact on me too. Like for me, the first time I saw it was last night. But I've been familiar with Koreeda. He was one of those one of the first Japanese movies I saw when I really started getting into Japanese film was Afterlife. And I just by chance I stumbled on that on eBay of all places, and it looked really interesting. So I paid the $12 for the movie sight unseen, and and I love that movie. Yeah, we talked about it a few seasons ago. It's a wonderful film, but I didn't seek out any of his other movies until Shoplifters. And then after I saw Shoplifters, I was just it was like being struck by a thunderbolt. And after that, I started seeking out more of his movies. And of course, it helps that my wife really likes him as a director as well. So she was always recommending stuff like After the Storm or uh I'm blanking on stuff right now, but but a bunch of other movies that of his that we've seen. Oh, I Wish, the which I should know because that is set in Kagoshima. And he is a really interesting director because I think more than anyone else, and probably the only person who comes close to reaching his level is Kiyoshi Kurosawa on depicting like the struggles of modern Japan and like kind of like, there's all this talk, cool Japan and all that, and like, I mean, one of my favorite examples is that you know, when Prime Minister Abe was still alive, he would praise anything Japanese that did well overseas, even if it wasn't necessarily Japanese, like when um that one author won the Pulitzer Prize.
Shigeru,
Um
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And he was not born he was born and raised in England. I don't even know if he actually speaks Japanese even,
Yeah, well, and
but
I think he himself has often said that he does not identify that he identifies more as a British citizen than he identifies
yeah.
as Japanese.
Yeah, and when he won the Pulitzer Prize, Abe was like, "Oh, this is such a great honor for Japan and everything." When Shin Godzilla got very popular overseas, it was the same kind of idea. And then when Shoplifters won the Academy Award, silence, dead silence from. But other people in the LDP were like, "Well, this movie is bad because it promotes crime," and it was just that kind of like ridiculous stuff. And whenever I watch his movies, Kore-eda does this amazing thing where he takes these very he takes these very serious issues, but he presents them in a way that is at the same time mundane but extremely captivating. Because last night I wasn't sure how I was going to feel going into this movie because it was late at night. My daughter was monopolizing the TV for a very long time, and then it was like 10:30. I'm like, oh, I got to watch a 2.5 hour movie now. I'm not sure if I'm going to be interested. I'm not sure if I'm going to fall asleep. I was riveted throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, and I think that is one I think feature of Koreda is that he takes very potentially dramatic and fraught subjects, but presents them in a very reserved way for the most part. And kind of lets the images do the talking and doesn't resort to shouting or screaming or dramatics to make you feel things. Um, Other things I'll say about Koreda as a director, I think that he has often because he started in documentary filmmaking, and I think you can see that in a lot of his fiction films that he has this sort of documentarian approach. But he's always quick to say that in a film like Nobody Knows, in a film like Shoplifters, he takes inspiration from actual events. And I think there's even a little disclaimer at the beginning of this film that says this is inspired by the Sugamo abandonment case, by a particular incident. However, it is heavily fictionalized. So like he doesn't make documentaries in this case. He takes inspiration. He does a lot of research for Afterlife. He interviewed more than 500 people about their experiences and used some of those actual interviews in the film. So he does sometimes use non-actors and he uses like improvisational footage in his films, but he's quick to say that, he takes inspiration from these events, but he's not actually trying to create, a historically accurate version of them. And I think also, I would say that he kind of, to me at least, has three major phases of his filmmaking career. You have his early work, which includes the movie Maboroshi, Distance, which kind of feels like a documentary, even though it isn't, and then Nobody Knows, which to me are just kind of minimalist. They have this sort of unpolished, in a good way, look. They're very simply told, but they're masterpieces of craft. Like they're very well made. And then you kind of have the middle period where you see movies like Our Little Sister and Still Walking and I Wish, which to me are a little shinier. They feel a little bit more like, there's money behind them. There are more famous actors in them. And honestly, they're not my favorite. I feel like they're a little more sentimental. And then I feel like he's kind of entered a third phase with Shoplifters and Monster, and Broker, and The Truth. Broker was made in Korea, The Truth was made in France, where he's kind of merging those two. So there's the minimalist aesthetic is still there. It's a little more polished, but it kind of goes back and forth. And I have mixed feelings about that. I really enjoyed Shoplifters. I really enjoyed Monster. I haven't seen, and I thought Broker was okay. But I think it's just been really compelling to watch how he has changed as a director. Personally, I would say that my favorite film of his is Maboroshi, which is one of his earliest films, and it's just this beautiful, beautiful piece of art. But yeah, I've enjoyed seeing how he's kind of evolved as a director.
Yeah, and on that minimalist side too, I mean, Afterlife, even though it's got this fantastic concept of, people dying and then they go to this bureaucratic waste station, they have to select one memory from their life. It is very minimalist despite that. It's all filmed in like this office building. It's just anyone who's been to like any city hall in like a rural area of Japan can say that that's exactly what all the buildings look like. And I think for me, like I Shoplifters, I think is probably my favorite. Although I have recently seen Monster, and it did impress me a lot. I'm gonna be We're actually talking about that later this season as well, so I'm gonna be watching that again soon. Uh, but this one, so some background for people who don't know, because we've been mentioning about the Sugamo child abandonment case. This happened in 1988 in Toshima Ward, and there's a mother of five children. Um, so she had five children. The third died soon after birth, and the other three the other four, they were all living together in this apartment building. Um, and she abandoned them. She in the fall of 1987, she met a new boyfriend, and she told the oldest to be in charge of the mother, left him about 50,000 yen for the living expenses, and then left. And uh, only the oldest child was registered. So for anyone who doesn't know, in Japan, when you have a baby, you register the birth with City Hall, so you get them on officially as a resident. You get them on the family register, which is a thing here they do, which is a much longer story that I've got a lot of issues with. But and none of the all the other children, though, they were unregistered, and well, it says several, perhaps all, were unregistered, and none of them were attending school. And the so we're gonna talk about spoilers here. The spoilers is that one of the children, the youngest child, ends up dying in both the real case and in the movie. Although the reason why they died is very different. Um, in the real story, the youngest child was assaulted by friends of the oldest child and died. When the landlord tipped off the officials, they discovered the apartment and found that the oldest child, who was 14, was the and the other children, who was 7 and one was 3, they were all malnourished. They found the body of the child who died shortly after birth, and then they found the body of uh and they didn't find the body of the other one until later, I think. And eventually there was this huge news coverage. The mother turned herself in, and they'd been left alone for about 9 months. And the older child's testimony said that the younger child had been killed, and that her body had been buried in the woods in Chichibu. And those two friends were sent to a reform school, and the mother had received a 3-year sentence for child abandonment, suspended for 4 years. um, he was also the oldest child was also indicted for abandoning a body, but was remanded to a care facility. And after the mother's 3-year sentence, she regained custody of the two daughters, which is kind of surprising. But but anyway, so that's the Sugamo child abandonment case. And the reason why I'm just saying child A, child is because they don't release those details in Japan, because out of respect for the children's privacy. So they're very strict privacy rules, especially around children in Japan. That's also why if you're ever looking at pictures of if you know any teachers who are working in Japan and they're posting pictures with their students and the faces are like covered up with emojis or anything like that, that's why it's out of privacy concerns. So that's something that they do here is just as a cultural note too and a legal note too. Um, but what were some of the things that kind of jumped out at you this time you were watching it?
So, in thinking about, the inspiration for this story, I think it's telling that this could have very easily become a melodrama and it could have very easily become this, utterly tragic and horrifying story, but it's not. And I think that the reason for that is that the camera very frequently focuses just on the children and on the children as observers. So there's actually, I would say, very limited dialogue, which is nice, because you don't really need dialogue to explain what's going on or how these children are feeling. Instead, the camera just watches the children watching. There are so many shots of the children like observing their mother or observing kind of warily the new friends that the older son brings home, or, looking in a store window at something. And then in another way, the camera is also sometimes the eyes of the children. So we see things from their point of view, looking out the window, because in the beginning of the film, the mother tells them that they're not allowed to go outside. They're not even allowed to go on the balcony because she has moved into this apartment telling the landlord that she only has one child, when of course she actually has four. And so I feel like by focusing on the children's point of view and these wonderfully, wonderfully natural performances that Kore-eda, I think, always gets from his child actors. He's really, really good at working with child actors. And he's talked a bit about how he does that, how he just, reads their lines to them, doesn't give them like a script to memorize, like just tells them what to say. And they obviously improvise a bit as well. Um, so these very natural, not at all gimmicky or cute performances from these kids just makes this such a beautiful, I think, exploration of childhood in a way. Like, obviously a very sad childhood and a very sad situation for these kids, but it's so good at just presenting the point of view of this particular group of kids, and I just think it does that really well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think so too. And the because we never really get a sense of the world really outside of the apartment. Like we don't see much of the neighborhood they live in. We don't, once the mother leaves, that's it. She's gone. We don't see her again, and we don't really follow anything that happens to her after that point. Because the focus here is just on the kids and what they're experiencing, what they go through. And Yuya Yagita as Akita, the oldest boy, I mean, he was like I said, I already knew he was a good actor from Ganabo, but to go back and to see what a great actor he was in this movie, I mean, he won Best Actor at 2004 Canes, and he was the youngest actor in the history of the festival there. And and some of the things I wanted to talk about is just some of the there's a lot of social stuff that's even though it's based on a real story, there's a lot of other social stuff that's baked into this too. And like the way that Japan as a society treats single motherhood and and just like the way and the things that the mother is going through, Keiko. Like you said, you talked about the voice she uses, the affectation. So why don't we start there? Talk a little bit about that whole idea because foreign viewers especially might be very confused by that.
So I think it's interesting to note that the actress who plays the mother is named Yukiko Ehara, and she goes by Yu, spelled You, which is kind of unique because in Japan, normally, if you were, Yu is a name, it would just be Yu. She goes by the name Yu, and she's called Yu-san. And people might recognize her as one of the commentators for the TV series Terrace House, which she did for many years. And she has, for many years, been what people might call a tarento or talent. So she is, just kind of a personality who pops up in a lot of TV programs. But she started off as a model and she was married, I think, to a couple of people in the entertainment industry. So she was a bit of tabloid fodder for a while. So it's interesting to see how her own life mirrors a bit of the character's life. You know, who the character is obviously this sort of young, irresponsible woman who has had several children with several different fathers. And yeah, has this affect that, again, is not unusual, but where she kind of speaks in this sort of lispy baby voice and really acts like a child with her children. Like she has, you know, she has authority. She isn't just like nutty, but when you see her interacting with her kids, you often feel like she's one of the kids, and isn't so much, you know, a parental figure. She's acting like one of the kids. Um, and I think it's also interesting this time in particular. I remember the first time I watched this. She's easy to hate. You know, she's so flighty and so selfish. And there were two lines that stuck with me 20 years later. There's one where she's about to leave for the second time, and she's in the donut shop with her older son. And he's criticizing her, and he says, "You know, Mom, you're so selfish." And she says, "What? I'm not allowed to be happy?" Which is just, oof, yeah, you could you spend a lot of time unpacking that. But then there's another one where the older son, while she was gone, has basically gone to several of the fathers of the children saying, "Can you please give us some money?" And one of them, you know, after much pressing, finally gives him 5,000 yen, about $50. And later, when he tells this to the mother, she says, "Oh, that's all he gave you? That's terrible. Your little kid's in a jam." To which, you know, I was like, "Well, yes, in a jam that you created." Like she doesn't take any responsibility. And yet, at the same time, this time, viewing, I was struck by how we're so quick to hate her, but or at least I'm so quick to hate her, but I don't turn any of that hatred toward the fathers, who are equally responsible for this situation that the children find themselves in. And the mother says that at one point. She says, "You know who the real selfish person is? It's your dad, for just leaving us all together." And that is true because, I mean, the mother is 80% gone, but she was there occasionally, whereas the fathers are just completely gone. So I think that was at least one thing about the mother character that shifted for me was while she is still a really loathsome character, I did start to think, why is it that we focus all our hatred on her and we don't throw any of it at the fathers, though?
No, I felt the same way too. And watching that, how she's interacting with them, and those two lines jumped out at me too, especially the second one. Especially when because after she says that, she also says to him, you know, if you have a problem again, just go and ask him for more money. So
Yeah,
she's encouraging him. She's basically telling him right there, like, this is going to happen again. So you should be ready for it and get ready to beg your, you know, Yuki's potential father for
yeah,
more cash.
right. Hmm.
And, uh, but also too, the pachinko parlor worker, the one who gives him the 5,000 yen, he even, you know, comes right out and says, he's like, you know what, I'm not her father. I wore a
Yeah,
condom every time I had sex with your mom.
yeah.
Which also was kind of weird that you're talking to a
Exactly.
12-year-old boy about this too.
And that's, I mean, so many times poor Akira, the 12-year-old, is thrown into situations he absolutely should not be in. You know, he is forced to take on this ridiculously adult role of, you know, going and begging these men who are basically total strangers for money, or managing the finances, or, you know, monitoring the moods and the health of all of his siblings. And I feel like some of the most heartbreaking scenes in the film are the scenes when he is just trying very momentarily to be a kid. And there are moments when he, like, you know, spins in a circle in the park, or when he joins like a local school baseball game, or just, you know, invites some kids from the neighborhood to play video games at his house. And it's always so brief because he knows that he can't really do that. He has to be the responsible one, and your heart just breaks for this poor kid who was never allowed to be a kid.
That sequence with the other kids really kind of stood out to me because this is the point really where you can see him breaking. And he's
Yeah.
just like he's completely like shunning the responsibility. So he's, you know, he's using the money to buy
Yeah.
a video game and all that.
Mhm.
And, you know, and they're and the kids even say to him at one point, he's like, "Oh, I'm hungry. Let's have snacks. Come treat us." Right? So
Yeah.
they're using him for to
Mhm.
buy them snacks and stuff too. And,
Yeah.
you know, they encourage him to shoplift. And you can see
Yeah.
him just being like, "You know what? I want to stop having the responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's really when things turn a lot for him, because you see before that, when she first leaves, they've actually got their shit pretty together for the
Yeah.
most part. I
Yeah.
mean, and both him and Kyoko are able to be pretty responsible, right? They're taking care of the laundry. I'm sure they don't have the best diet. They're just eating like, convenience store ramen, but still they, just trying to make sure that their younger siblings eat. They're trying to do some kind of job at, keeping the place together. He's trying to take care of things like the rent and the bills. I mean, I was thinking too, when he goes to an ATM machine to make to take money out, or to make rent payments. That's these bank transfers, they're very confusing. I've been
Sure.
here
Yeah.
for I've been here for 15 years and it still
Yeah.
confuses me.
Yeah.
But having a little kid doing that, who probably has as much knowledge of written Japanese as I do, which is not
Yeah.
that much.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that can, but he's able to make it work. And also, another cultural note too here for anyone who's watching it, there is one scene when he's in the convenience store and you see the clerk stamping all these things. That's actually how a lot of bills are traditionally paid in Japan. So for anyone who's confused by that scene, that's another like cultural aspect, because now you can do it through bank transfers or electronic transfers, but a lot of people still do it where they get their bills in the mail, they take them to the convenience store, they pay it at the convenience store, and then they stamp them like that. So if anyone's confused, that's kind of where that comes from. But also, going back to the mother, yeah, I've got a very mixed reactions towards her. Like, I do wonder too if there is an element of possibly her involved in some kind of prostitution or compensated dating here, because there's this high school girl that the family befriends named Saki. And at one point she tells Akira, I know how to get the money. And she goes on this. So there's this thing called compensated dating in Japan, where you will basically, you pay money to a girl to spend time with you, basically. And it's kind of like, it could be prostitution, it could not be prostitution, right? It's one of these things where there's a very gray area. In this case, it doesn't seem like it's prostitution. She's like, I just sang karaoke with him. But when she tries to give Akira the money, he freaks out and he runs away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and Angel Kosai is compensated dating, and I will say that this is a one of many sort of timely issues that comes up in this film. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and David Lahaney has a great book about this called Think Global, Fear Local, where he kind of talks about these moral panics surrounding things like compensated dating. So yeah, as you described, Angel Kosai was basically this phenomenon where young women, mostly high school aged women, would solicit, usually at the time via like telephone call services or something. This was before social media was really a thing, but they would find mostly older men. Who would pay them for dates. And yeah, sometimes it was just they would pay them to go to a cafe together, or they would pay them to go to karaoke together. And these kinds of things still exist today, in that there are like dedicated cafes that employ high school girls where older men can pay a fee in addition to paying, for drinks and stuff to just spend time with high school girls. Sometimes sex was also exchanged for money. Sometimes it was just companionship. But I think it's important to note that there was this feeling in the late 90s and early 2000s that this was incredibly widespread, and that parents, you have to be careful because your high school age daughter is probably engaging in enjo kosai, and that was just not true. There was no evidence that this was a rampant phenomenon that everybody was doing, but it was a salacious topic of media, and so it got a lot of attention, and it was kind of seen as a symbol of the breakdown of Japanese morals and the family and stuff like that. So I wasn't surprised to see it pop up in this film. And if anything, I feel like the way it was depicted in the film was just kind of to show yet another example of neglect. because Saki, the high school girl that they become friends with, she is also in a sense abandoned and neglected, not in at the same level. Like she still has a house and a place to sleep and a place to eat, but she's basically stopped going to school, and it seems clear that her parents just don't care about what's going on with her. So, I just felt like it was a chance to show just another side of neglect and abandonment.
No, especially because at the end, she seems to be with the family more or less. Like that ending's kind of ambiguous, which we'll get to that, and I want to talk about that ending too. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to talk more about this movie.
Welcome to the White Lotus in Thailand cut.
It's a wellness center.
You should get a facial. The lady in the airport thought you were my dad.
Oh my God.
The Emmy Award-winning HBO original series returns.
There has been more crime on the island. I'm a little freaked out.
What happens in Thailand stays in Thailand. Oh, what does that mean?
It means we're not dead yet.
Amen.
Amen.
A new season of the HBO original series The White Lotus premieres February 16th at 9 p.m. on Max.
You found your person. Now let the Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
And we're back. And so that's why I had this suspicion that maybe the mother's involved in some sort of similar activity, because she is always going out at night. Ostensibly, she's spending time with this boyfriend, but she always comes home stinking of booze. There's also one point where she gets a phone call, and like it does seem to be like an actual outing, because they're talking about karaoke and all that, and asking her to come right back out after she's just got back in. But there's also another part where she's talking about the fathers of Akira and Kyoko. So all we really know about Akira's father is that he had worked at the airport. What he did at the airport, was he a pilot? Was he, a baggage handler? We don't know anything. All we know is that he worked at the airport. Now Kyoko, we get a little bit more hint about her, because Keiko talks about how Kyoko's father was a music producer, and that they were going to make a record together, and then it all kind of fell apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which makes me think that she was one of these. She was like a potential idol in training or something like that,
Yes.
and this
Yeah.
music producer just, basically used her and then tossed her away when she got pregnant.
Yeah. And I think, this again just kind of emphasizes how much we are seeing everything from the kid's perspective, because it's pretty clear that the mother is lying a lot, or that she's just kind of fudging certain details. Like, she says that, I have to go away for work. But then Akira calls the phone number where she said she was working, and they tell him that she resigned a month ago. Or she says, oh yeah, your father worked at Haneda. Did he? We don't really know if that's true. We get the feeling that she makes up all kinds of stories. She says that at one point she says she's in love with someone new, and I love that Akira just responds again because he's clearly used to this. And she says, he's in love with me, we're going to get married, and then after he agrees to marry me, I'll tell him that I have 4 children and it'll be fine. Which of course, again, it's like, really, were you ever really planning on telling this person that you had kids? I don't think so. And so I think it's interesting that we see from the kids' perspective, particularly the 2 older kids' perspective, they know in their hearts that she's lying, but they don't really want to face it. Like the daughter, Kyoko, after Akira gives them New Year's presents and says they're from the mother, eventually she gives him back the money, and he's like, oh, but this was your present. She's like, and you can tell she knows that this was not really from the mom. And so, yeah, so we get a very limited picture of what the mom actually did, or who she was actually dating. And yeah, I think we are supposed to suspect that she was probably involved if not in selling sex, she might have worked in a hostess club. She might have worked in some sort of, sex adjacent industry, what they call the mizushobai, or the water trade, where she, worked in a capacity where she was like working in a bar and she got paid to serve drinks to men or spend time with men or something like that. But yeah, just the fact that she very frequently comes home late and drunk and, dressed in a certain way indicates that, yeah, she was probably engaging in some either sex work or stuff that's similar to sex work.
Yeah. So also a cultural note on that too, if anybody has no idea what we're talking about. Easy way to explain it: if you've seen Tokyo Vice, the club that they're in, that's basically an example of the Mizu Shobai, the water trade, where it's not necessarily sex, it's like companionship and all that, but it's there. And sometimes there is that strict line in some of these businesses, and sometimes the line is a little bit blurrier. So it's one of those things where I have seen things online where it's like, oh yeah, they're all brothel. I'm like, well, no. It's sometimes they are,
Yeah, not really.
sometimes they're not, and sometimes it's kind of like a roundabout thing where you have to go through a process to get to that point. So it's a lot of different things happening there. There was one scene too that had to deal with, well, first off, about when you mentioned the New Year's presents, that struck out to me too, especially because there's this he keeps going to this convenience store, and at one point some of these other kids, they steal stuff and they drop it in his bag, and the owner thinks it's him who's stealing them, and then the clerk kind of stands up for him and says, no, I think it was these other kids who did it actually. And the the owner even kind of like gives him some meat buns and stuff like that, and to help him out a little bit. And later on there's another clerk who's giving them like leftover sushi bowls and that kind of thing. And he goes to one of these clerks and he asks her to write out the New Year's presents. And I did notice when Kyoko got hers, she's looking very intently at the message, and then later we see her comparing like one that her
Yeah.
mother had wrote and one
Yeah.
that she knows her mother wrote, and the other one she realizes they're not the same.
Yeah.
And yet, and that was kind of heartbreaking when she gives
Yeah.
him back the 4,000
Yeah.
yen, and he's like, but that was for your piano.
Yeah.
And she's
Mhm.
just like, no, it's okay. um but also, speaking about Kyoko, there's this scene when her mother is painting her nail polish, and then that nail polish starts to chip and fade, and we see it. And then later, when the mother comes back, and Kyoko has the nail polish out, and she spills it and knocks it over and spills some, and the mother gets mad. She's like, "Oh, you
Mhm.
shouldn't go near my things and all that."
Mm.
And there's also some nail polish on. I noticed there's some nail polish on Kyoko's finger at that point,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
Kore-eda made a point to focus in on that. It's like a
Yeah.
close-up shot.
Yeah.
What did you think about the significance of the nail polish?
So I thought that it was kind of an example of how this movie shows the passage of time in really subtle ways. It doesn't rely on voiceover. It doesn't go show us any text of like 3 months later, 1 week later, or something like that. Instead, it just like we see, the Christmas decorations, we see the cherry blossoms, which anybody who lives in Japan knows. It's like, oh, okay, so that means it's April. We hear the cicadas, which we're all hearing right now. We see that the children are sweating, so it's obviously hotter, summer has come. And that nail polish, I think, is another really poetic way of just showing not only the passage of time, but how long their mother has been away. So first, we see the mother kind of engaging in this sort of motherly behavior of painting Kyoko's nails. And that nail polish starts to chip and fade away, which shows us that the mother's been gone for quite a while. And then when the mother is home briefly, Kyoko spills the nail polish. The mother gets mad, and then the camera every now and then shows us the faded imprint of that nail polish on the wood floor. As again, it's like, okay, so now it's really been a long time since the mother left the second time. Um, so I feel like you can interpret that the nail polish, chipping, fading, gradually fading away in a couple of ways. One, it's poor Kyoko's gradually fading romance of her mother, where in the beginning she does kind of want to believe that her mother loves them and is gonna come back, but over time, like Akira, she becomes more realistic and disillusioned with that idea as the nail polish fades. But I think it's also just one example of the very interesting ways that the movie deals with time and the passage of time.
Yeah, I had thought about that too, as kind of a symbol of her relationship with her mother, especially when and I think if I'm remembering correctly, like when it's on her finger, she wipes it away.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
that also kind of struck me as maybe another sign that she's just giving up on any hope of her
Yeah.
mother, like being her mother. Um, there's also a point when they're when he's talking to the clerk, I think it was the clerk, and the
Mhm.
clerk is like, "Well, why don't you?" Because he's asking for a job. He says like, "Well, how old do I
Yeah.
have to be to work here?"
Yeah.
He's like, "I'm only 12 years old." She says, "Well, you have to be
Hmm.
16 to
Hmm.
get a part-time job."
Hmm.
Um, and she says to him, "Well, why don't you talk to like social services or something like that?"
Yep.
And he says, he's like, "If we do that, we'll get split up." And it's
Yeah.
happened before, he
Yeah.
says,
Hmm.
which is probably another reason why she's hiding the fact that she's got all these
Yep.
kids from the landlord.
Yep.
And because if it's a 12-year-old kid, and you don't see the mother for a while, but you see the 12-year-old, you can pretty much take care of himself. You're probably not going to be as worried about that, especially in Japan. Yeah. But when you see like these younger kids around
Mm,
too and no mother, then you're probably gonna get suspicious and call child services, which is probably
exactly.
what he's referencing when he says it's happened before. And it
Yeah.
just struck me that the system that we have set up, and this is not only true in Japan. I don't want to make it sound like I'm bashing the system here in Japan, but I think this is true in a lot of countries. This risk of splitting up the family, it disincentivizes
Yeah.
self-reporting,
Absolutely.
which is a big issue.
Yeah, and I think, the thing with lying to the landlord, this also I think was a timely topic and has been a timely topic for like 30, 40 years now, which is Japan's declining birth rate and the many challenges that people who have kids face. And one of those challenges is it is difficult to rent an apartment when you have young children. Now, legally, no landlord will say, "Oh, we're turning you away because you have kids." But if they find out that you have small children, especially multiple small children, they may just kind of come up with some convenient reasons why you can't move into the apartment. And as the landlord in this movie says, "Oh, yeah, well, the older kids are okay, but the younger kids, tenants tend to complain about them." And anytime you hear, "Oh, people might complain," then that's a death sentence for anything you want to do. And this has been commented on a lot in Japan because, you know, there are so many challenges to raising children in Japan, and one of them is that there's not enough daycare centers, and then you find out that whenever people try to build the government or private companies try to build new daycare centers, they often experience a lot of backlash from the neighborhood because they say, no, those are too noisy. I don't want a daycare center in my neighborhood. And when families try to rent an apartment instead of buying a house, they will often get pushback from landlords or tenants. And so I felt like that was kind of a sort of quiet commentary on attitudes toward kids in Japan, where on the one hand, you have the government and a lot of mass media saying, have more babies, we need to have more babies. But then at the local level, you have a lot of obstacles to being able to have and raise kids.
Yeah, this is something that's become a huge bugaboo of mine in recent years now that I do have kids, because it is absolutely insane to me how the government will always talk, and they're always coming up. There's, I think, what was it, last month or something, where the LDP came up with another panel discussing about methods to increase the birth rate. I'm like, well, it's actually a pretty simple thing when you think about it. Provide
Mhm.
more daycare centers, provide more childcare, provide more flexible work hours, raise the salaries, and provide more support for families. It's pretty easy, and yet
Yeah.
they keep going around and around and around. And
Yeah.
one of the things I saw, I think it was in Tokyo, that they're trying to do is, well, there are all these young people who aren't dating, so we're going
Yeah.
to create a matching app. And I'm just like, this is the
Exactly. Yeah.
dumbest thing I've ever heard of, because
Yeah.
you're going to add it to like the other 50,000 dating apps there already are in Japan. And
Yeah.
because it's a government one, it's probably not going to work that well anyway.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
it's like the problem's not that they don't have any, they can't find people to date. The problem is they don't have money and they don't have
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Exactly.
But it's and yeah, and the apartment thing too. I was doing, you guys, we're not on video here, so you guys can't see me, but I was doing scare quotes when she
Yeah.
said legally, and I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's
Mhm.
that word legally is doing a lot of heavy
Mm.
lifting.
Oh, yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
and I've seen this I'm lucky in Kagoshima because
Mm.
there are more vacant properties than there are renters. So
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
they're just happy to have somebody who wants to rent the damn place, is what it
Yeah.
usually comes down to. But
Mhm.
I have, even before I had kids, when I moved into this one apartment building. This couple with a young son, they moved in above me. And first thing they did when they come, because in Japan, one of the
Mm,
things that you do when you go to
yeah.
move into a new building is you go around, you introduce
Yes.
yourselves to the neighbors, you give them some kind of gift or something like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
And if it's a family with young kids, you apologize in advance for the kids.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've had to
Yeah.
do that now since we've had kids. We've had to
Hmm.
go around to the neighborhood and let them know. Even now, we live in a house which is kind of
Mm,
disconnected from the rest of the
yeah.
neighborhood, but we
Yeah.
still went around. We're
Yep.
like, we're sorry if our kids are too loud,
Yep.
in your house, like, a
Yeah.
block away.
Yeah. We're sorry for existing, basically.
Yeah, basically,
It's-
yeah.
yeah.
And when kids are, because I've seen this happen at preschool, my kids get sick constantly at preschool.
Mm, mm.
Just today, in fact, my wife had to take off work because one of my kids was sick. So, and it's luckily she's in a job where they're pretty understanding, but not all jobs are like that. I
No,
mean,
no.
like me, I'm
I
a
would say the majority of jobs are not
yeah,
understanding about
yeah.
that at all.
I mean, my job is, I'm a freelance teacher. So
Mhm.
if I don't teach a class, I don't get paid,
Yeah.
period.
Right.
So
Hmm.
there are a lot of obstacles
Yeah.
that are, and so in light of that, that's another reason why I have a very mixed opinion of Keiko, the mother, because on the
Mm,
one hand, yeah, she's being irresponsible. She's being selfish, incredibly so. Um, but on the other hand, you can tell she's drowning as well. And
mm,
she is
mhm.
trying, and one of the reasons she is doing this, and I can see how she justifies this to herself, where she's like, up to a certain point, I can see where she justifies it, where she's saying, like, look, I have to do this so that I can, I can basically get a rich husband who can take care of me and my kids. That's the only way she knows to escape from this situation. And she's probably not wrong about that being the only escape for her.
Yeah.
Um, and so I feel for her on that. There's this one scene when Akira is watching Keiko as she sleeps, and you can see
Hmm.
this tear
Yep.
come out of her
Yep.
eye.
Yep. Yeah, that was I felt like the one moment where we are kind of meant to sympathize with her was that, yes, she's irresponsible, she's selfish, she's flighty, but she's also human. She's a person who is overwhelmed, and her response to being overwhelmed is just to be in denial, I think. We can imagine that she hopes to find a rich man to save her, but I also think she has just kind of decided that she's going to live her life for herself, and she's going to come back to her kids when she feels like it and when it's convenient. But they're not a priority. She's just decided to not make them a priority. And, to be fair, she's made that decision. The social welfare system has made that decision, and the fathers have also made that decision. So,
Yeah, and
everybody is kind of neglecting the kids.
exactly. And that's a good point. In all of these situations, it's just like, the kids are too much of a problem
Yeah.
for us to deal with. The father's like, too much of a problem. We're not going to deal with it. And it's complicated too, because in Japan, there aren't things like alimony and stuff like that. So and we don't even know if she was married to like
Yeah.
Akira's father or any of these. My guess
Right.
is probably not. But
No.
In other countries, if you have a kid, and even if you're not together with the mother, you still have to provide some sort of support legally. That doesn't really exist here in Japan, which is another huge issue. It's something that came up when we talked about the movie Dark Water a few seasons back too, because that has very similar
Yeah.
ideas in that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mhm. And I think one thing about that too is that, child support and alimony does exist in Japan. It's just very, very difficult to get people to pay. And I think the consequences are not as severe as they are in other countries for not paying. And like you said, when you're not married, it's a lot more difficult to force somebody to pay their alimony and child support. And I mean, I know from friends' experiences in the United States as well. It can also be very difficult to get people to pay their alimony and child support in the US as well. But um, in Japan, yeah, it can be really difficult to get people to pay, which is why uh when we talk about poverty in Japan, so many of the people in poverty are single mothers. Because when you're a single mother, you're already stigmatized in a certain way by society. The kind of work you can do is quite limited. because you can't work the same hours because you need to take care of your children. You probably can't afford childcare, and if you can't get one of the very limited spaces in subsidized childcare, and you're likely not receiving any child support from your child's father. So yeah, it creates a really, really challenging situation.
Yeah, I mean, Japan is ranked 8th in tackling child poverty. And something else that surprised me, and I can't remember the exact statistic, if it was like 1 in 5 or 1 in 7, like children in Japan are living in poverty. But when you focus in on children from single parent families, it's half. Like
Yeah,
half the
yeah.
children in single parent families are living in poverty.
Mhm.
And that's not a new thing here. That's been
Right.
going on for a while.
Yeah.
Uh, in fact, it's probably gotten even worse with the weakening of the yen and the
Hmm.
cost of inflation and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah.
I mean, again, this movie came out in 2004. The Sugamo child incident was in 1988.
Mm,
These problems are not going away. They're still here,
yeah.
and nobody's really doing anything about it. Which also, and
Yeah.
even Kore-eda himself seems to acknowledge that when he made Shoplifters almost 20 years later.
Yeah. And I think, if you look at Nobody Knows and Shoplifters and you compare them, obviously there are a lot of similarities. And I think you can kind of see the seeds of some of Shoplifters in Nobody Knows. Like, just Koreda loves to talk about the idea of found family, and, just the question of what is a family, what constitutes a family has been a question that he's been asking for a long time in his movies. But I think we can also see, almost 20 years apart, these two films, um, the changing face of poverty in Japan. So around the late 90s and early 2000s, people started to talk about this new face of poverty in Japan, where in the past, when you thought about poverty, you tended to think of like older single men. And you tended to think of men who, were working odd jobs and living in the Sanya neighborhood, and kind of just getting by without any savings or security. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, you started to see more and more attention given to what they called internet cafe refugees, which were these young people who were maybe estranged from their families, and they were living in internet cafes. And also just the idea that the new poverty in Japan was young. There's a lot of young people, and it wasn't necessarily like young people from poor families. It might be young people who were estranged. It was also a lot more women. And I think it isn't necessarily that, they were completely new. It was just that they were more visible now than they had been in the past. And so by the time you get to Shoplifters, you start to see this interesting variety. I think The Family in Shoplifters represents, very different kinds of poverty, where you have a young woman who is estranged from her family. You have two children who were abused and neglected. You have a woman in her 30s who was abused by her partner. Then you have an older woman who's kind of scamming the pension system. So I think in all of Koreeda's movies, but definitely in Shoplifters and Nobody Knows, we can kind of see the different kinds of poverty and the different ways that poverty manifests in Japan.
And also in the case of the old woman in Shoplifters too, she was also, you know, not necessarily physically abused, but she was basically tossed away by her husband. So
Right.
there was that
Yeah.
aspect of it too.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot in Shoplifters. I think that was an episode I think back in season 1. I had a lot to say
Mm.
about that movie.
Yeah.
And that was back when I was doing it solo, so I didn't actually have a discussion on that.
Okay.
But what did you think of the ending? Because obviously this ends in a different way than the actual child
Yeah.
abandonment case, right? And in
Hmm.
fact, I got chills when those kids
Mm.
started coming over to the apartment because I'm like, oh crap,
Mm.
they're gonna,
Yeah. Hmm.
and I thought they were gonna kill, and I thought that the kids were gonna kill one of the younger ones, and I thought it was actually gonna be Shigeru. Because
Mm.
there's this
Hmm.
one scene, one of the kids like kind of
Hmm.
pushes him out of the way and
Yeah.
everything like that. So I
Yeah.
figured that was what we were going towards,
Yeah.
which I want to say I'm glad that Yuki died
Yeah.
from a fall,
No. Yeah.
but on the other hand, I am kind of glad that it didn't go as dark as I expected
Sure.
it to. Um,
I think, yeah. So in terms of the ending, like, this is actually, I use this movie as an example of something that I think is called bookending, where basically in a film where you open and close with the same image, and yet by the ending, you, the viewer, have a lot more knowledge. And so your reaction to that image is very different than it was the first time. And so Nobody Knows opens with this image of Akira on a train, holding a suitcase. And as the viewers, we know that something is wrong. Like we can see that Akira, his hair is kind of unkempt and long. There are holes in his shirt. His hands are kind of dirty, and he's holding the suitcase. Beyond that, we don't really know anything. And then near the end of the film, we get that same shot, except this time we know that in the suitcase is the body of his dead sister, and that he is going with Saki, the high school student, to bury her body. And I feel like, I mean, that's just a gut punch, obviously, to, to think about the first image and then the second image and how much has changed. But I also think it's really interesting that, yeah, like you said, Kore-eda makes the choice to not have Yuki, the child, die at the hands of another child, which, is a choice. It could be a bad or a good one. I think it works. I think it makes for a better movie.
Mhm.
And also makes the choice, this movie makes a lot of choices about what not to show us. So we don't see Yuki fall. We don't see anything of the mother's life. And we don't see the climax that we do see in Shoplifters, because Shoplifters, of course, ends with the family being arrested and held to account for what they have done. Whereas in Nobody Knows, the movie just kind of ends, and the kids are just going about their lives the way they always have, and you get the feeling that that could continue for a very long time. It does end also with more money arriving from the mother and a note just saying, I'm counting on you. And but that too, that's one thing I really like about a lot of Kore-eda's early films, is that they do frequently end that way, with this undramatic, very simple, just kind of, and it just continues on sort of ending, which to me is just feels a lot more authentic, and it feels like he's asking us, the audience, to do the work. He's not going to spell it out for us. And I like that aspect of the ending.
Yeah, it completely lives up to his title. Like in the end, still nobody knows.
Right.
And yeah, and also it is too heartbreaking when you think about what happens around the fact when Yuki dies too, is the fact that this is when Akira was going out and being a kid, when he joins the baseball game.
Yep.
And like that incident, and then also when he's playing games with the other kids, and that's when stuff really starts to go down for them. And you can see this, and the movie doesn't come right out and say it, but you can tell there's probably some sort of shift in him after this, where he realizes, like, I am not a kid. I cannot afford to be a kid.
Exactly.
And I have to, and this is the consequence. And also he had talked about, I'm starting to get choked up thinking about it, but he had told Yuki that he was going to take her to Haneda to look at.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah.
And sorry, just want to finish my thought here, but the scene at the beginning of the train when he's with the suitcase, like, I remember I was watching that last night, and I didn't know what was going to happen at the end, but like the way he was holding the suitcase too, there was something loving, and also there was a sadness to like the way he was touching the suitcase.
Yeah. So it's not, that particular bookend, it's not a twist. It's not a shock. It's like, kind of in your heart of hearts, that there's something is off, but you don't know exactly what it is. But so that when you see the follow-up image, it's like, oh yeah, buddy, of course. But and I think, the title, this time watching the movie again, I was really thinking about the title. And I feel like Kore-eda does this a lot with the titles of his films, that they have this kind of double meaning, or they can be interpreted in different ways. Because on the one hand, the title of this movie is Daremo Shiranai, nobody knows. But everybody knows. They do know. That's the thing. It's like the landlord's wife knows. She comes and can clearly see that these children have been abandoned and they're malnourished, but she does nothing. The convenience store staff know. They give them food and they do nothing. The mother knows. The father knows. Like, so in a way, people act like they don't know what's going on, but they actually do. And I feel like that is, Kore-eda's kind of subtle condemnation of this whole system, is it's like, you'll pretend that you don't know, but you actually know.
In kind of a funny way, it reminds me of the the opening scene in Train Man when
Mm.
the when the drunken businessman is going out and he's causing a scene and he's verbally assaulting these women, and everyone else just flips open their phones in like a almost choreographed sequence.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And yeah, and yeah, you're right. Everybody knows.
Mhm.
And two, it made me wonder at the end is where are they walking to at the end? Because now that everything's been shut off in that apartment, now that obviously the rent has not been paid, it makes me wonder if they had to leave the apartment, if they're now going somewhere else.
Yeah, that's a good question. I get the feeling that at least within the world of the movie, at the end of the movie, we're supposed to think that they're still living in that apartment. And I think what's clear is that even though the electricity's been turned off, the water's been turned off, they haven't paid the rent. It seems like the landlord and his wife are not going to do anything because if they did something, then they would have to get involved. Then they would have to be the ones to call Child Protective Services and engage in all the mendokusai, the troublesome work of dealing with this problem. And so I think they're just choosing not to deal with it, and therefore choosing, again, to pretend they don't know. And
Mhm.
so then the kids can keep living there. Now, of course, in the real life situation, they did eventually get involved when someone died. And in this case, I think it became too clear and they just had to get involved. So if this movie had continued on for longer, that might have happened eventually. But I feel like as the movie ends, I think the kids are probably just going home.
Mhm.
Maybe they're going to the park for a bit and then they'll go back home because
Yeah.
they don't really have anywhere else to go.
It would be if it did continue that way too, it would have been another similarity it shares with shoplifters, in that once someone dies, that's when the
Yeah.
authorities get involved
Yeah.
in the situation, and usually get
Exactly.
involved in the worst way is what happens
Yeah.
in shoplifters, which is probably what we could have expected here
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Uh, any final things you wanted to say about Nobody Knows?
Let me just see if there was anything else I wanted to mention. So I think again, I'll just say that out of all of Cordeda's films, I think that this is definitely one of my favorites. I think it's one of the most well made, and I'm just again and again struck by how much this is a movie about looking, observing, and noticing. How the camera is very observant, the kids are very observant, and how skillful it is at showing rather than telling, which I think is a mark of really good filmmaking. And the extent to which we really, the viewers, we really feel like a fly on the wall in this house, and how vulnerable and intimate that is to put us in that position. And it's heartbreaking. The story is heartbreaking, but it's not maudlin, which I think to me is a contrast with some of his later films, which I do feel like venture a little too far into sentimentality. And for me, Daremo Shiranai is just the exact right kind of moving, where it just presents you with the situation and lets you react and lets you feel without spelling everything out for you.
I think so too. Yeah, there's this very fine line you have to walk with this kind of subject matter, and Kore-eda walks that line, you know, masterfully. I think if this is a movie that could very easily become misery porn,
Yeah.
and he doesn't do that. Like
No.
and because I was to be honest, I was kind of expecting that from what I've heard
Mm.
about this movie,
Yeah.
knowing about the incident it's based on. What my wife had told me, she's like, "Oh, it's very sad. It's such a sad story. It's so," and I'm like, "Okay, all right. All right.
Mm.
So here comes 2.5 hours of misery porn." But it wasn't that.
No.
It was very enjoyable. Surprise.
Yeah, and
Weird
it's
to say,
like
but yeah.
yeah, and I think this is another really interesting thing is that there's not a lot of music in this film, which I like because I feel like some of his later films there's a little too much music. But the music when it appears is very jaunty and upbeat, and very playful. And I just feel like that to me shows this really interesting contrast between this very grim reality that the children are living in and the fact that we're seeing it through the children's eyes, it's also kind of like a fairy tale because it is, the older children are aware that this is bad. But for the younger children, it's just like this is kind of a fantasy, it's Home Alone. It's they can do whatever they want. They can play and they can run around. And so that to see through the children's eyes, it's just, oh, we're just at home and we're playing the piano and we're running around and doing stuff. So it's not brutal. It's for the kids, a lot of the time they seem happy. Obviously they're not cared for, and I don't want to trivialize what they are going through, but I think the movie does a really, really good job of switching back and forth between that perspective of the kids, where at times it's like, okay, we're all right. And the adults where it's, oh, no, 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 this is very bad. So yeah, it's and like you said, it's definitely not just relentlessly grim. That's not what comes through in this movie at all, which with Shoplifters, I wouldn't say Shoplifters is relentlessly grim, but I do think it's a lot darker.
It's a lot darker. It is.
And in particular, the ending is just bleak as anything. Yeah.
And and as much as I do love Shoplifters, it's a lot less subtle than Nobody Knows.
Yes, that's true.
Which I think is also kind of, it may be a reflection of Kore-eda's own frustrations at the problem.
Sure,
These problems are still there, and it's just kind of like, well, now we got to start hammering people over the head with this.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is a great discussion, Lindsay. Thanks so much for coming on again. Why don't you tell people where they can find you?
So you can find me on Blue Sky and Instagram at News from Nihon, NEWS from Nihon. I also have a website. I think it's just lindsaynelson.jp. And you can find my movie reviews, mostly of Japanese horror movies, but just Japanese films in general, at eigafile, EIGAFILE.com, eigafile.com. So I'm around writing stuff occasionally, and every now and then I post on social media about Japan related things.
Okay, great. And we'll have links to that stuff in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out. As for us, japanonfilm.com is the website. Japan on Film is the social media handles. That's Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. And we are part of the Film Stories podcast, so check them out at filmstories.co.uk. Listen up after the credits to hear what is coming up next on the network. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.